is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Whoa. And if our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what can stand against? And if our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what can stand against? Then what can stand against? Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Whoa. If our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what could stand against? And if our God is with us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what could stand against? Then what could stand against?
Our God is greater. Our God is stronger. Amen. He's higher than any other. Thank you, Jesus.
You hear me when I call. You are my morning song. Though darkness fills the night, it cannot hide the light. Whom shall I fear? You crush the enemy underneath my feet. You are my sword and shield, though trouble lingers still. Whom shall I fear? I know who goes before me, I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. My strength is in your name, for you alone can save. You will deliver me, yours is the victory. Whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? I know who goes before me, I know who stands behind. The God
wonderful. He's always with us. Through the times that we're so excited and elated in the things that He's doing in our lives, and the times that are hard, He's with us through everything. Thank you, God. Jesus is the sweetest name I know, and He's just the same as His holy name, and that's the reason why I love Him so. Oh, Jesus is the sweetest name I know. Jesus is the sweetest name. Jesus is the sweetest name I know, and He's just the same as His holy name, and that's the reason why I love Him so. Oh, Jesus is the sweetest name I know. Say the name of Jesus. Say the name of Jesus. Say the name so precious. No other name I know. Say the name. Say the name of Jesus. Say the name of Jesus. Say the name so precious. No other name I know that can calm your fears and dry your tears and wipe away your pain when you don't know what else to pray. heaven without us. So Jesus, you brought heaven down. My sin was great, your love was greater. What could separate us now? What a wonderful name it is. What a wonderful name.
Praise the Lord. We're going to go ahead to our subject of the day, and I ask a question, and I'm hoping for a specific answer, but when is it a good time to respond to the Lord? You know, there's some people that if they have God speak to them in a spiritual retreat on a Friday or Saturday or a Thursday night or what have you, they say, okay, God, next week I'm going to do something powerful for you. There's some people that hear God speak to them and they like Gideon, begin to put out fleeces and try to verify that God, in fact, is the one that's speaking because they have this fear that they're hearing only their own voice. Now, let me just tell you something. If all of a sudden your own voice tells you, go and do something powerful for God, go ahead and follow it. It's probably not your own voice. That's the thing. It's the voice of God speaking to us. But here we are. And the real question that we're going to have before us is, are you a procrastinator? You know, there are two kinds of people, as far as I can tell. There are the procrastinators that are honest about it, and there are the procrastinators that lie about it. We all have a tendency at times to put off till tomorrow what we could do today. And if I were to come by and visit you at home, you might be just knowing that I was showing up, scrambling around to put this away and that away. Why? It was okay when you left, but knowing that Pastor was going to show up, all of a sudden it's another situation. And now that putting off till later, you say, oh, I shouldn't have procrastinated about that. There's times where we're getting ready to go and we're packing the bags, and all of a sudden recognize, oh, we need to do a load of laundry. You know, we could have done that last night, but we didn't. And there's a tendency in every one of us with our eyes looking ahead, we tend to think this may not be as high a priority as others. And you know what? In the reality of our lives, there are certain things that we can procrastinate about. There are certain things that are not a priority. You say, it's nice if we do that, but it's not something that we are driven to do. But when it comes to God and Him speaking to us, we need to be very careful about the tendency of procrastinating. And we could even make procrastination look spiritual. We can make it look good. Oh no, I'm like Gideon right now. I'm waiting for God's confirmation. We can look at it like that, can't we? Oh, I'm still praying and interceding. God's giving me a further revelation of what I'm supposed to do. You know, there's a point in which God speaks and He expects us to move. And when we understand that God is in charge, I remember growing up, my dad would tell me, now you're going to go out and get your first job. And here's the thing, when your boss tells you something, you don't complain about it. You don't say, oh, I'll do it. If he says jump, you say, how high? That's the immediate response. And now, I don't tend to be that much of a procrastinator, really. I tend to have an idea, and I move on it, and I go. And sometimes I drive myself to the ground because I'm going so much and so forth. But we all need to understand that when it comes to God, we need to respond immediately. With God, if we do not move on time, if we do not move immediately, we will pay the price. And you know what? If we go back into the Old Testament, in the days of Moses, he led a generation out of Egypt. And they went across in a very quick fashion across the desert. And then they found themselves at the edge of the Jordan, and they sent spies across into this new land that God was promising them. God had promised them. Repeat with me. God promised. And so what would the reaction have to be? Move. Go. God says, go. God says, this is your land. And so they send the spies, and you know what? The spies come back, and they say, you know what, wait. We've analyzed the situation. How many have ever had God tell you to do something, and then you prayed about it and had a new revelation? Be careful.
Because what happens is that generation ends up with a promise from God that they would quickly be into the promised land. But that promise ended up where that whole generation for 40 years had to wander around in the desert, never receiving, and except for Joshua and Caleb, no one was able to go into the promised land. Because of a procrastination, if you will. Because they didn't believe God in a timely fashion. Did the situation change in the next generation? No. They just simply believed God. The situation hadn't changed. If anything, it had gotten worse. It had given 40 years for the country, this place, to prepare. The walls of Jericho, if anything, were bigger than they were before. But they were not going to procrastinate anymore. When God says, start crossing, did they say at that point, all right, with Joshua leading, did they say, wait, we'll just stand here and wait for the waters to cease? And we remember in the previous generation that God brought all of the Israelites across the Red Sea and opened up a way. So now here we are at the Jordan. It's at flood stage. And so we'll just wait here until God has done his job. You know what? There's so many times that I hear Christians that they say, we're just waiting on God. And you know what God's saying? Just waiting on them. Because that generation understood that. They didn't say, let's wait. Joshua says to the priests that are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, he says to them, go ahead. And when they stepped into the waters ceased upstream. Now, you know what? If waters cease upstream, it takes a while for it to realize downstream. We have, where I live, there in Chapala Haciendas, we live on kind of a hill. And when we built, we exceeded our original budget because we had to build retaining walls to hold up the dirt behind us and to kind of level the area because it's on it's not that bad. It's on an incline. It's on an incline. But there's a house behind us. And on occasion, the person in the house, now I don't know if they're a renter or they own it, I don't know. But they had this ingenious idea to say, we're going to leave the hose on in our yard. And after about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, I imagine, all of a sudden, our retaining wall, where we have put pipes in it just for the rainy season, that the water would be able to get through, all of a sudden, water's flowing out into the back of our house area, where we have also a drain and for the rainy season, and it runs it out into the front. And I'll look out, and there's water running down our front driveway, and I think, wow, I wonder if we have a broken pipe. And I go out and I start walking around the house. Oh no, it's not a broken pipe. It's the neighbor. They're flooding their yard and giving us their water as well. It's such a blessing. If I could just redirect it so that I could use that water somewhere else, I don't know. But anyway, so I will leave because I think, the neighbor, perhaps the people behind us, perhaps they're busy people. Perhaps they forget easily. They forgot they left the water on, and I will go around the whole area because it's behind us. It's another street, and get there, and I'll go over to their house, and I'll ring the doorbell, and I'll knock on the door, and no answer. And no answer. And so what do? I walk around and I turn the hose off myself. I mean, if no one's home, no one's going to answer. And the water, obviously, their yard doesn't need more. So I turn the hose off for them. And after I turn the hose off, you know what? It's still about 2 hours before it stops running out the front of my yard, because it's already saturated. It happens when it's upstream, and it's the same thing. Here, the Israelite priests step into the water, and they're going to be there for a while. How many like walking in wet shoes? But they heard God say, go. And when God said go, he didn't say, just wait a little bit longer, I'll give you the right moment. No, when God said go, they were supposed to go. They were supposed to move. But the first generation did not believe God. The first generation used their own logic. How many have ever been guilty of procrastinating what God is telling you to do because your logic got in the way? They also did not respond to the Lord because they were convinced of their rights. They have the right to make their own decision. You know what? I'll tell you, as a believer, you no longer have any rights because Jesus purchased you. You are a slave now. At that moment, you have no more rights. When you are a believer, Jesus has complete ownership over you. He can send you where he wants. He can do what he wants to do with you. I had a conversation with somebody the other day that was talking about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because there are some who do not believe that in the New Testament that they continue to tithe. It was what was brought up. And I said, you know what? That's fine. In the New Testament, Ananias and Sapphira were killed for not giving 100%. If you'd rather that system, that's fine. Because the reality is that everything we have, every piece of property, all of our money, all of who we are, our future, our hopes, all of them belong to Jesus when we are purchased. And he gives them to us. And we can be generous people now with it. We can respond. And we can love on him. But that generation, the generation that Moses led out of Egypt, they did not respond because they were convinced of their rights. And you know what their rights ended up with? Their rights ended up with them getting an opportunity to die in the desert, procrastinating. How many would like to die saying, I wish I had, or I could have, all of your life? Writing there on your tombstone, they had a lot of potential. That's not what God has in store for us. In Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 7 and following, it says, so as the Holy Spirit says, today. When? Today. If you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. When was the rebellion? We just talked about it. During the time of testing in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested and tried me. How did they test them? By being people that procrastinated. Didn't obey when God said go. He says, they tested and tried me, though for 40 years they saw what I did. That is why I was angry with that generation. I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. Be encouraged, but encourage one another daily, as long as it is called, when? Today. So that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the end. What conviction? Our original. When God spoke, we moved on it. As has just been said, today, again, he says today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. Who were they who heard and rebelled? Were they not all those Moses led out of Egypt? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies perished in the wilderness? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't give you the opportunity to follow along. You have it in your Bibles. Hallelujah. And so we have this example. And the writer of Hebrews informs us that was a sinful, deceitful generation. For what reason? Because they didn't believe God. They didn't move. And we can sound really spiritual and say, oh, but God hasn't made it clear. I will tell you that God is the one who decides whether he's made it clear. There are people there's a little bit of every one of us who tries to think, no, I don't know for sure that God is telling me something. But God has spoken to your heart. God speaks to us on a regular basis. There are people that come to me and they say, Pastor, how can I be sure that God is speaking to me? You know why they're asking that question? Because they are pretty sure God's speaking to them. And they're looking for an excuse, looking for another test that they could do to wait and not respond. Because if God was speaking to them, something that they wanted to do, just if God spoke to their heart and they said, and God says, go around the next corner on the street. I left $100,000 for you in a bag. It's a plastic, it's just a paper bag. It's not marked. It's nobody else's. It's yours. You know what? I promise you, you wouldn't call me up and say, Pastor, how do I know for sure that God is speaking to me? Because I think he's telling me to do something, and I'm not 100% sure. You know what? You wouldn't bother to call. You just do it. Hello? And we need to have that much excitement, that much energy in obeying God in everything that he says. Another example of somebody that obeys God is Noah. Notice what it says about Noah. In Genesis chapter 6, I'm going to read verse 9, 14, and 22. It says, this is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man. Now, who is he? A righteous man. Now, how do we recognize him as a righteous man? I will tell you in just a moment. Blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. What does that mean? That's why he was a righteous man, because he walked faithfully with God. But what does that mean? So God says to him in verse 14, so make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. And in verse 22, because he goes on with this long list of how to build this ark, at the conclusion in verse 21 of how to build the ark, he says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. That's why it says that he walked faithfully. That's why it says that he was a righteous man, because God gave him a task to do, and guess what? He did it. Imagine that. All of his neighbors looked at him and said, you're crazy. And you know what? Here's the interesting thing to me about Noah. Because if you think about Noah, Noah's work wasn't something that he could jump on tomorrow and finish the next day. Matter of fact, if you look at the list, there was 110 years from when God got angry with the generation to when the flood happened. But probably when you start to calculate, and there's cues in the scripture of the birth of his sons, etc., that we can get a rough idea that it probably took Noah and his family between 55 and 75 years to build the ark. So it wasn't a job that he did in one day. It wasn't a job that God says, do this, and he says, okay, I have extra time, I have a few hours, so I'll go ahead and take care of that. All of a sudden, Noah, his whole life, his profession is changed. He instantly becomes a shipbuilder. Now, that would be a process. God tells him, get it from gopher wood. So he has to figure out where to get gopher wood. He has to harvest a lot of gopher wood. It wasn't a day where he could just pick up a phone and call the local lumber yard and say, send me a big truckload of gopher wood. He had to go out and find it. He had to cut it. You know what? He didn't even have gasoline yet for his chainsaw. He had to prepare the wood. He had to haul the wood. He had to put it all together. He had to create it according to God's design, God's plan. He had to coat it with the pitch. He had to do all of these things, and this process took 55 to 75 years, they estimate. That was the process. I ask a question. If Noah had not responded in the first year, or if Noah had waited a month even to start, would the rains have come a month later? Would the rains have come a year later? Would Noah have been the righteous one had he waited? Because God's timing is perfect. If you read through the scripture, the rains came at precisely the moment. It's according to the scriptures that when he finished building the ark, imagine this. He finishes building the ark, and let's just imagine that it took 75 years. And the day he finishes the ark, he looks over at his wife and he says, whew, it's finished. And you know what happens? Within 7 days, 1 week, every type of animal on earth shows up with their pair. Now, what would he have done had he put it off a week in starting and all the animals showed up and he hadn't finished the ark? That would have been a disaster. And in that week, notice, none of the animals procrastinated. We even today have the sloth, even today. Because it showed up on time. Think about it. Even the sloth didn't procrastinate. Heard the word of God say, all right, this is the week, get there. And they got there. Every type of animal that we have today was rescued and came in 1 week's period of time. And at the end of that week, it was to the moment that God shut the door of the ark. And when God shut the door of the ark, the rains came. They were not early, they were not late. God orchestrates everything according to his time schedule. And what is it that we need to learn? Because if we, as people of God, have a tendency of procrastinating when he says go, you are going to be more like the generation dying in the desert, never seeing the great things that God could have, would have done through you because you procrastinated. Or you could be the person like Noah, who hears God say, do something. And it's a big task. You know what? When we have some great work to do, it seems like there should go into a little bit more planning. You know, if God says to you, do something, and it's visit a neighbor, you could think, all right, I could do that tomorrow. I'm ready to go and do that. When I wake up in the morning, I'm going to do that. He tells you at night while you're sleeping, go and visit this friend, and you're going to pray for them, and they're going to be healed, etc. And so you can get up in the morning and say, I can do that, and you go and run and do that. But if God tells you something one day, and it's going to take you the next 75 years of your life, wouldn't it seem rational to contemplate just a little bit? Just to think, well, okay, now if I do this, now what is, and we all have a tendency of the bigger the job, the more we consider the repercussions. But you know what? The reality is that no matter how big the job is, God expects immediate response. I'll tell you something, that when somebody comes to know Jesus as a personal Savior, I've shared the gospel message with countless people and shared them with them on the streets, and they don't tell me, now look, this sounds really good. A couple have done this, but normally they don't. They say, let me contemplate this a little bit. No. They say, wow. And I say, is there any reason why right now, today, and what are they doing? They're changing their entire life. They're changing their whole eternity, and they make the decision in just a matter of moments. Yeah, okay, I'll pray with you. And it doesn't make any difference how big the task is. When we're responding to God, we respond immediately. The day that, as I already mentioned, that Noah finished the construction, all of these things started taking place. The rains happened. Now, this last week, we also started reading in the book of Matthew. And in Matthew, it really struck me, a guy named Joseph. Now, Joseph, if there was anybody that should have, could have, and would have contemplated a little bit more of what God was saying, would have been Joseph. Because God starts to tell him some things that really are difficult to follow. It's really difficult to accept. Number one, imagine Joseph one day going to his family and saying, you know what, God spoke to me and told me to marry a pregnant woman. How many know that the parents are going to say, what? I think you need to reconsider. You know what you're going to be doing to yourself? So on. But look at some of the things that happen. In Matthew chapter 1 in verse 20 to 24, it says, but after he had considered this, what was he considering? Divorcing her quietly? An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he thought about it for the next week and a half, and then obeyed God. Isn't that what it says? It doesn't say when he woke up the next week. I mean, he's making a decision that will impact him for his life. Are you sure? I mean, there's people that people of God, Christians, they get up and they say, wow, that was a weird dream. I must have had too much pizza last night. God speaks to us, and we rationalize it away so that we can be a procrastinator in God. Why? Because we're comfortable with our life. Imagine if Joseph had been comfortable with his life and say, no, that's just a little bit more of a challenge than I'm ready for right now. That's not the future I envisioned for myself, God. Thanks. Just put it off. But what does he do? Joseph, it says, woke up. He did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife that day. That day. Now, I'll tell you that I think that there's a reason why Joseph responded that night, that day. Because one night Joseph hears from the angel, and the next day he was married. Now, why is that? Because if you put off what God tells you to do, every moment you put it off, the more your own logic, your own way of thinking about things will start to block you and say, oh, wait, maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe I need to analyze this from another angle. You know what? When God tells you to do something, there's no other angle to analyze it from. Because it doesn't matter at that point how you feel about it. If God tells you to do something, you do it. Like I was already saying, that if the boss says jump, you say how high. And if we are servants of the Most High God and He owns us outright, then when He says something, we have no right to say, well, let me think about this just a little bit longer. But far too many Christians do. They think about it. And when they think about it, they come up with all kinds of reasons why that couldn't be God. That couldn't be God telling me to do that. Because that just doesn't make any sense. After all, God is the one that gave me my logical mind. We fall prey to it. And we talk ourselves out of some of the most incredible blessings that could have ever come our way because we procrastinated in God. Just as the generation with Moses talked themselves out of the great blessings. They could have been the ones to go in and see Jericho fall. Could have. But they didn't. What did they get to see? Desert. And unfortunately, there are a lot of Christians today that they're walking around in the desert of their own desires because they were afraid to move. And you can put all of the terms on it that you want, but procrastination ends up forming doubts and can change your mind to not follow God. The decision to marry this young lady who was pregnant was going to affect him, his family, his future. And what did he do? He said, before I have a chance to think about what I'm doing, I just better obey God. That was his response. But you know what? It's interesting because it seems that this is who Joseph was. He learned this lesson. I don't procrastinate when God says something. Here, in the next chapter, in chapter 2 of Matthew, we read this also this last week. It says, when they had gone, in verse 13, an angel of the Lord, who's they? Those were the wise men. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So when their money ran out and all the funds that they got from the wise men were used up, he got up and... No, it doesn't say that. It says that this is what God tells him. And in verse 14, it says, so he got up, took the child and his mother, when? During the night. During the night. And left for Egypt. God comes along to him, and let's say that he went to bed at 10 o'clock. God taps him on the shoulder and says, Joseph, I need you to do something. Take the child, go to Egypt, because there's some people that want to kill him. And you know what? At midnight, he gets up and he says, God told me to do something. I better do it. And he gets Mary, because you imagine, here's a young mother. How many know that young mothers are tired? They're tired. I mean, if we figure that maybe Jesus was a year old at that time even, or still, I mean, whatever your conception of Jesus' age at that time, because he probably wasn't still just an infant or just a recently born baby, but a mother of a toddler has been running all day long. Hello? And so Joseph looks over at Mary and says, sweetheart, you know what my wife would say, don't wake me up. We've got to go. Where are we going? We're going to Egypt. Huh? Yeah, we're going to Egypt. Can we talk about this in the morning? No. Think about that conversation. He flips on the light switch. No, actually, he lit the candle or whatever it was. And they have to pack up all of their things. Could you imagine what their neighbors are thinking? What are they doing next door? Don't they know it's the middle of the night? What is their problem? And what were they doing? They were getting ready to go. And the neighbors never see them again. Probably the neighbors were thinking, I wonder if they paid their rent before they left. Wonder what made them leave But what was the motivation? He wasn't trying to think about, what would everyone think? I better rationalize this. I'll wait till the morning. I will discuss this rationally. You know what? He says, when God speaks, there's no issue in talking about it, in discussing it rationally. We just do it. And so the scriptures reflect that. He says, so he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where they stayed until the death of Herod. And so it was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. And so I ask you, how long did Joseph have as a tendency of waiting? He didn't. God says it, and he does it. God says it, and he does it. I want to propose to you that perhaps that's one of the reasons why God allowed Joseph to be the father figure, earthly father figure of Jesus. There's no room in obeying God for procrastination. And Joseph was displaying this. Another text, still in the same chapter too, verse 19 now. It says, after Herod died, see they're in Egypt now, and he says, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. Now he's in Egypt. And said, get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead. So, what did it say? He got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. Now, that was years later. Now, I don't know. Maybe you've moved a few times in your life. You know, there's a point when everyone, they've moved, and they say, I just want to stay put for a while. You know, Joseph could have said, you know, no one here is trying to take his life either. We came here because somebody was going to kill him there, and he's safe here. Why don't we just stick around for a little bit longer? He could have used his own common sense. And Mary could have said, you know what? I just was getting to know the neighbors. Do we really have to move again? Where are we going this time? Now, I don't want to make you feel like Mary would have been a procrastinator. I'm sure that's not who she was either. But that could have been the rationale had they chosen to move into that belief system, to move into that way of thinking. But when it comes to serving God, we are not required to rationalize what he is saying. God has told me to do some things that were crazy. And some of them I did. I wish I could say I did them all. Because the crazy things that I did without thinking about it, without realizing just how dumb that idea must be. But it was from God, and God did great things, and it was the great source of joy and blessing for the family. And now I step back and I say, boy, I wish that I could have been that person that had obeyed all of the times. And looking at the scriptures, it appears Joseph was like that. God would say something, and he'd say, okay, let's go. He was never too comfortable to obey God. He was never too decided on his own trajectory, his own way of thinking, to be able to say, I'm not going to serve God in that particular way. He continued. So when God spoke, Joseph moved. And that's how it needs to be said about us. Instead of saying on our tombstone one day, they had a lot of potential, how would you like it to say just simply, when God spoke, they moved? Wouldn't that be wonderful? We don't have to describe all the things that God did through us. Just, that would be the greatest thing. That we say, wow, we were faithful in obeying God. We were faithful in what He is saying. We must be very careful then how we live. Not as unwise people, but today, if we hear His voice, we say, today I'm moving. We cannot afford to be procrastinators in God. We have to be ready to act and not to wait. We have to not say, oh, there's going to be a better time. Tomorrow would be a little bit more convenient. Next week, I don't have anything on the schedule. I'll do it then. When God says we do something, we do it right now. Now is the time to respond to God. I asked at the beginning, when is a good time to respond to God? Now. When you hear God speak, that's the time to respond. Ephesians 5:15 and following says, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise. Now, some of us think about that and we say, oh, that means I have to rationalize things. I have to use my wisdom. I have to do. No, that's not what it's saying. Then he says, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. People could go to the writer of this letter to the Ephesians, Paul, and they could say, Paul, you weren't very smart in how you chose to present the gospel. Everywhere you went, you got beat up. I mean, everywhere you went, every time you got on a boat, it was shipwrecked. Paul, use some common sense. Be wise. Here he is saying, don't be unwise, but be wise. Our earthly perception of things can be, let's not be reckless. But here we are, these many years later, and what do we think about Paul? That he was a reckless person? Or rather, he was somebody that was willing to obey God, whatever the cost. Wherever it went, whenever it was, we're going to serve Jesus, is what he is encouraging us to be. He says, make the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. So we cease putting off till tomorrow, and we start moving today. That when God speaks, we jump. We jump. Bow your heads with me, if you will.